Soon after VE Day, the inhabitants of the cities and towns which had been demolished in the titanic struggle between the Red Army and the Nazi Wehrmacht began the slow process of rebuilding their communities. In Stalingrad, the people went about the task of building virtually a new city on the ruins of the old.
At that time, soon after VE Day, we saw no reason why the Russian system of government and democracy as practiced by the Western allies could not live side by side in the world, provided each respected the rights, the territory, and the convictions of the other, and each system avoided overt or covert action against the integrity of the other. Because implicit in Western democracy is respect for the rights of others, it seemed natural to us that this live and let live type of agreement could be achieved and honestly kept. That was probably the most for which we ever really hoped.
But although General Eisenhower found the daily life of the Russian people fairly similar to that of Americans, the reconciliation of the two ideologies was a far different matter, the general was convinced.
Marshal Zhukov seemed to be a firm believer in the communist concept. He said that we Americans induced a man to do things by telling him he might keep what he earned and might say what he pleased. In spite of my complete repudiation of the Marshal's contentions and my condemnation of all systems that involved dictatorship, there was no doubt in my mind that he was sincere.
With the wartime alliance receding into the pages of history, the Russian-American relationship grew steadily more troubled. The strain was most apparent in Germany, where Russian and American decisions on the administration of conquered Germany often clashed directly. Russia's blockade of Berlin, an attempt to cut off supplies for the city's western zones, came perilously close to precipitating a major crisis. This Soviet policy of belligerent bluffing was thwarted by the British and American airlift, which successfully ran the blockade for 11 months and finally forced the Russians to end it.
Several years of growing tension have shattered our dream of rapid progress toward universal peace and the elimination of armaments.
In the organizing conference of the United Nations at San Francisco, people all over the world saw new hope for international accord.
The democracies must learn that the world is now too small for the rigid concepts of national sovereignty that developed in a time when the nations were self-sufficient and self-dependent for their own well-being and safety. None of them today can stand alone. If the men and women of America face this issue as squarely and bravely as their soldiers faced the terrors of battle in World War II, we would have no fear of the outcome.
Between the victory in Europe and the final victory in Japan, in this most destructive of all wars, you have won a victory against war itself. If we had had this charter a few years ago, and above all, the will to use it, millions now dead would be alive. If we should falter in the future in our will to use it, millions now living will surely die. And we now will together, dearest God,
For millions of Americans, from private to five-star general, their service in World War II forms the most memorable experience of their lifetime. This great global war, which consumed 6 years, took the lives of some 30 million people, both military and civilian. With ironic justice, Germany, the nation which precipitated the conflict, was left in ruins. The Allies paid an exorbitant price for victory, the lives of 13 million fighting men. This costly struggle, which overwhelmed the whole world, was instigated by one man. Early in the 1930s, Adolf Hitler began his quest for power with ostentatious displays of the growing might of his fanatical Nazi movement. The Führer hypnotized so many Germans into becoming his followers that the Nazis soon felt strong enough to challenge the world with impunity. Nazi troops pushed relentlessly across Europe. In only 9 months, they conquered 6 nations. But each new victory only whetted Hitler's appetite for more. On a Black Friday in June 1940, German troops marched into Paris, and the gay French capital turned quickly into a spiritless Nazi garrison town. With Germany now in control of the continent right to the sea, Hitler stepped up his air attacks on England. In the crucial battle for Britain, the steady, heavy pounding by the Luftwaffe was met by the courageous resistance of every Briton, from the average workman to Prime Minister Winston Churchill.
Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty. So bear ourselves as if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years. Men will still say, this was their fighting power.
In December 1941, Japan helped crystallize America's feelings toward the war. There was no longer any uncertainty.
Since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
It was decided to concentrate first on the Nazi enemy. Through the dangerous waters of the North Atlantic, American ships carried a steady flow of men and material to England to prepare for battle with the Germans. In the waning days of autumn 1942, 1 million tons of shipping proceeded silently on the Atlantic toward Gibraltar in the first major Allied offensive against the Nazis. This was the greatest armada to sail into battle in history. Surprisingly, the convoys were not attacked during the crossing. The first Allied offensive consisted of simultaneous landings at 3 points on the coasts of North Africa. In the early morning of November 8, 1942, Allied troops started ashore at Casablanca, at Oran, and at Algiers. No one could be sure of exactly what the French garrisons, under the command of Vichy France, would do by way of opposing the landings. On most of the beaches, the landings were lightly opposed. All 3 beachhead areas were soon secured. Allied units moved quickly forward against the Nazis to the east. For 6 months, Allied forces hammered continuously at the Nazi line in some of the most bitterly contested battles of the war. American GIs met their first real test in combat and came through in magnificent style. In the Libyan desert to the east of the Nazis, British 8th Army Tommies pounded the Nazi Africa Corps from the other side. Caught in a vice, the Germans were doomed. The 2 Allied forces pushed the remaining German troops into a smaller and smaller land area and finally succeeded in wiping the Nazis right off the African continent.
The only living Germans left in Tunisia were safely in our hands. The number of prisoners during the last week of the campaign alone reached 240,000. Included in these captures was all that was left of the Africa Corps and a number of other cracked German and Italian units.
The The Allies celebrated their hard-fought victory in the streets of Tunis on May 20th, 1943. The next moves in the Allied strategy called for an invasion of Sicily, followed by landings on Italy itself. The first troops scheduled to land on European soil were American paratroopers, used on a larger scale than ever before in warfare.
Okay, I'm okay. Okay, we okay. We're okay. Everybody okay. Yeah!
Sicily was invaded by Allied forces on July 10, 1943. And in 38 days, this key Mediterranean island was completely in Allied hands. The assault against the enemy on the European continent was to be made by Montgomery's forces across the Messina Strait, which separates Sicily from Italy. Farther north on the Italian coast at Salerno, the American Fifth Army joined the attack less than a week later, and the Allied offensive gained momentum. The Italian campaign proved one of the toughest in the war. GIs had a stubbornly resisting enemy to contend with, plus very difficult terrain, disease, and miserable weather. In London in January 1944, General Eisenhower assumed the post of Supreme Commander, Allied Expeditionary Forces, and with his staff began planning at once for the major cross-channel invasion of the French coast. The plan called for the landing of 2 million Allied soldiers along the Normandy coast, followed by a quick breakout from the enemy's encircling positions. A supplementary invasion of the French Mediterranean coast was to be made by an Allied army group. The combined force was to surround and isolate the valuable Ruhr area and then drive deep into the heart of Germany to final victory over the remaining Nazi forces. The French coastal area was given a thorough softening up by Allied planes as the moment for the gigantic invasion drew near. Critical points in the rail and highway systems inland from the beaches were high priority targets. The great invasion force was ferried across the channel in more than 4,000 ships and small craft. Virtually every type of Allied assault vessel was included in the D-Day Armada, which carried 150,000 troops toward the invasion beaches. No enemy opposition was encountered in the crossing. As the fleet neared the Normandy coast on the morning of June 6th, Allied warships trained their guns on the German coastal defenses, and the battle for Europe was joined. The moment all the Allied world had prayed for was finally at hand. For some of the men in the assault force, this was their first taste of action.
Prepare to cast off.
The GIs in the landing boats realized that it was up to them. The Nazis, who had not expected an invasion at that exact time, massed their strength for a heavy counterblow. It looked as though the battle for the beaches about to begin would be a savage fight. It was a very tough fight. On Omaha Beach especially, the attacking units had a difficult time holding on to their limited beachhead. Any hopes for a fast, easy victory were quickly dispelled. On some of the beaches, invading forces had to cope with very heavy seas. Some of the boats were badly swamped. The men in them were in no condition at all to fight the Nazis. On June 7th, the day following the invasion, General Eisenhower, accompanied by his naval commander-in-chief, Admiral Ramsey, toured the assault area offshore by destroyer. With the beachhead successfully secured, Allied forces pressed inland to keep the Nazis off balance. The drive through the French coastal provinces was accompanied by some very heavy fighting. On every section of the front, the GIs pounded at the Nazi line without let-up. Less than 12 weeks after the invasion of the Normandy beaches, Allied fighting forces entered Paris. The city was immediately restored officially to French authority. The arrival of the French 2nd Division, bent on wiping out the remains of the Nazi garrison, prompted an outburst of wild rejoicing by the Parisians. The Nazis surrendered on August 25th, 1944. They fully realized the hate Parisians had grown to have toward them and seemed to anticipate far from gentle treatment now that the positions were reversed. 2 days later, General Eisenhower, accompanied by General Bradley and Air Chief Marshal Tedder, entered the city quietly, but attracted such a crowd that they were forced to leave at once.
I promised that 2 of our divisions would march to the front through the main avenues of the city. I declined personally to be present at this formation, but indicated that General Bradley would stand the review to symbolize Allied unity.
Supplemented by the army group which invaded southern France, the Allies took up the pursuit of the Nazis across eastern France and up to the borders of Germany itself.
We were certain that by continuing an unremitting offensive, we would, in spite of hardship and privation, gain additional advantages over the enemy.
But the Germans were not quite through. In December 1944, Hitler planned a single, powerful counteroffensive at one spot in the Allied line, in the Ardennes sector. It was a staggering blow. In the Battle of the Bulge, the Nazis employed 3 armies totaling some 14 infantry and 10 panzer divisions. They drove head-on into the Allied position. Late in December, the Allies counterattacked, with the 3rd Army assaulting from the south and later the 1st Army from the north. By early January, the exhausting process of pushing the enemy back to his former line began. Additional reserves were brought up to strengthen the new Allied offensive, which hammered the retreating Nazis continuously. In miserable fighting weather, the Allies pressed forward and finally succeeded in closing the gap about 1 month after the Germans started their assault. With the Battle of the Bulge ended, the Allies continued the attack against the reeling Nazi armies. The Germans lost great quantities of valuable material in the month-long battle, equipment they would not soon be able to replace. More important still, the enemy suffered some 120,000 casualties. One of the most formidable military obstacles in the path of the Allied armies was the Rhine River. Crossings were made at a number of points against determined opposition. To General Eisenhower, the crossing of the Rhine was one of the most important steps in the hastening of the Nazis' final defeat.
We received a series of encouraging reports. Everywhere, the landings appeared completely successful.
Supplementing the amphibious assaults across the river was an attack the following morning by 2 airborne divisions, including paratroopers and GIs transported in gliders.
This was the most successful airborne operation we carried out during the war.
The ground forces which made the assaults quickly established a foothold on the eastern bank of the river and proceeded without pause to drive deeper into the heart of Germany.
The Prime Minister undoubtedly derived an intense satisfaction from putting his foot on the eastern bank of Germany's traditional barrier. Possibly he felt the act was symbolic of the final defeat of an enemy who had forced Britons back to the wall 5 years before.
During the following weeks, the Allied offensive picked up speed in its crushing advance across Germany. Numbers of GIs who had been captured by the Germans in earlier battles were liberated along the way. Just 7 weeks after the first Rhine crossing, American GIs met Russian soldiers at the Elbe.
It seemed fitting that 5th Corps troops, among those who had made the initial assault on the Normandy beaches, should be first to make contact with the Red Army.
In Berlin, the Russians were engaged in the savage battle for the city with the last-ditch Nazi defenders. Russian troops under the command of Marshal Zhukov penetrated deep into the German capital. The last of the Nazis surrendered to the Russians on May 3rd. The futile defense of Berlin had cost the Germans an estimated 500,000 killed and captured. After 4 exhausting years in which the Nazis had been beaten off in a series of epic battles, the Russians had won Berlin. The Nazis gave up formally in several areas. At Lüneburg Heath on May 4th, they surrendered their northern forces to the Allies, represented by Field Marshal Montgomery.
Now, I will sign the instrument on behalf of the Supreme Allied Commander, General Eisenhower.
Complete Nazi capitulation came on May 7th at Reims, when the Nazi High Command, represented by Colonel General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's trusted lieutenant, surrendered to all the Allied nations with General Walter Bedell Smith acting for the United States. The major phase of the greatest war in history was ended.
The Allied force, which invaded Europe on June 6, 1944, has, with its great Russian allies and forces advancing from the south, utterly defeated the Germans by land, sea, and air. This unconditional surrender has been achieved by teamwork. Teamwork not only among all the allies participating, but among all the services, land, sea, and air. To every subordinate that has been in this command of almost 5 million allies, I owe a debt of gratitude that can never be repaid. The only repayment that can be made to them is a deep appreciation and lasting gratitude of all free citizens of all the United Nations.